So last night I was prepping to do these slides again, and my 11-year-old came into my office, and he doesn't know anything about this. And he started reading this title, this whole title, right? From the Botnet, critically informed approach to botnets. And he just had no idea what I was talking about. So I do have a problem with long titles, but let me explain what this is. I was in the FBI for almost 16 years. In the last 6 years at that time, I was a profiler of criminal analysis unit. And there's a lot of things I worked on. I probably did hundreds of consults at the BAU. And it's everything from missing children to UFOs, but primarily I was looking at hackers. And one of the things that I looked at the most was how to message and influence people involved in cybercrime or nation's data. And something that's really stuck with me through all those years is how the U.S. government approaches messaging people involved in cybercrime and nation's data. My impression was always, this isn't really working. So what I wanted to do is explore, is there more behind that? And it starts with the content analysis of what they've been putting out for several years. Now, this doesn't work as the internet, but I was going to show you a video of just a short teaser of cybercrime felon named Olga. She's local, she's okay with me sharing her name. It's something I filmed about a year ago, and it was really just a teaser of that's what do we have. She's going to go and through this whole list, but what you would have seen in this video is a good example of really the stereotype of the way the U.S. government, probably a lot of governments, look at hackers involved in cybercrime and cybercrime. That it's really just about the threat they pose and how they can threaten them back. There's a whole other way to look at people involved in this kind of activity and different ways to approach them. So, here's what I'm going to go through today. A little bit about my background, the research samples I used in this research. This is ongoing research, so I'm sharing initial findings today. And I'm going to share the initial findings of that content analysis, and then also some of the background discussions I've been having with DOJ officials about the way they try to message cyber criminals and nation state actors. And then what I've tried to put together is maybe a model that practitioners can use, specifically the US government, but any government, to try and message and reach and influence people abroad involved in cybercrime in a different manner. I'm going to show you just briefly a visualization of applying this model. And then I also talked to a number of cyber criminal felons in the US, some who went to jail here and they're out, and some who had other arrangements here in the US, to get their feedback on their experience with these kind of narratives and what they think about this kind of approach and model. And finally, potential policy gaps as a result of this ongoing research, and then some future research as well. So like I mentioned, I was with the FBI for almost 16 years. With the behavioral analysis unit, I was a profiler for about 6. And one thing I specialized specifically was on online influence. And so field offices in the FBI and other agencies would come to us and ask us for behavioral support. And what that means is they had operations, they had investigations, and they wanted us to take a look at that activity and that actor to kind of come up with a different approach that they might be the most behaviorally responsive to, right? So you have a lot of operators and investigators who have experience, they have talent, they have a gut feeling about things and how to approach people and talk to them, but they don't always apply science to it and rigor to it and research to it in terms of what might be the most effective way to get the kind of response you're looking for. But if I had to break down what behavioral analysis is, truly, it's looking for vulnerabilities in you that can be exploited. That's what it really comes down to. And I'm not just talking about weaknesses, I'm talking about your strengths too. I'd say people who have the strongest types of personalities and think they really know who they are probably the most vulnerable. And that's what we do with behavioral analysis. We try to establish and identify those vulnerabilities and look for ways to exploit those vulnerabilities. So they have operational goals and investigative goals, and we try to match up behavioral goals with it. My experience with FBI field offices, what you're probably going to see in a lot of the initial findings with the narratives that come out from DOJ, which is a lot of the tone and the manner of the way they try to speak to people involved in cybercrime is threatening. And it's about projecting authority and strength. That's typically what we would see. And typically we would recommend against that because it's a different way, of course, to try and connect with people and build trust with them. My experience with the DOJ Rewards for Justice program is not overly positive, and a lot of that is because we always had a different view on how we measured success. A lot of their metrics was how many shirts did we give out at Black Hat, how many people are writing stories about us. For us, it's how many people actually came forward. On a call with that group years ago, I asked them this question: who are you actually targeting? And I wasn't trying to be an ass. I was legitimately asking, who are you targeting? And they didn't have an answer, which was a little shocking to me, because you can imagine with any kind of business, if you ask them, who are your customers? What's your customer segment you're trying to reach? If they don't have an answer, then what are they doing? But that's the kind of response I would get from DOJ Rewards for Justice. And to me, it reflected a lot of the impressions I was already forming, working with DOJ and FBI field offices about different ways to try and message these cyber criminals. And then in terms of my experience with cyber criminal felons, that's a newer thing for me. When I was in the FBI, I was never handling any felons who were in jail in terms of any kind of ongoing handling relationship. But since I left the FBI, I've started to meet more people that have been in those situations. When I was also transitioning out of the FBI, I started to talk to a lot more Russian cyber criminals who were just getting out of jail. There were surprisingly a lot of them in the US. And what was really interesting about that is there seemed to be this idea of them trying to repair their reputations. That was a great motivator, because they were really in a difficult situation once they got out of jail and not wanting to go back to Russia in a lot of cases. So this is where this idea was starting to originate. Like, is there a different way to reach someone like them? Because it didn't seem to work before, right? We see these stats all the time about cybercrime keeps going up. They bring down infrastructure pops back up. The impression has always been this isn't really effective, including naming and shaming. It's not really working. And even if it's hard to put a metric on, say, recruiting someone or getting their cooperation, those are often much more valuable relationships. So the research samples I have in this ongoing research is any kind of public statements that have been made by government officials following a botnet takedown. I chose botnets in particular because I was looking for a way to kind of carve out some kind of sample here or control group. Now, there's been 11 botnet takedowns since 2016 that I included in this sample. More than half of them have been in the past 2 years. So there's definitely been a sharp increase, right? Some of those botnet takedowns did have a foreign government nexus. I wasn't sure if I wanted to include them in it because I wanted to focus, I guess, purely on cybercrime, but I don't think I could do that anymore because those lines are blurring anyway, and it's hard to know where those relationships are. So I included them as well. My research sample does also include background discussions with DOJ officials involved in these botnet takedowns and these announcements. Obviously, there's experience from my own cases that I worked on. I can't mention which ones they are, but they were national level ones in terms of discussions privately with some of these botnet herders to try and get them to cooperate in some manner. And then finally, I do have pending written Q&A with DOJ and National Crime Agency in the UK. So here are the initial findings at looking at the narratives I've collected from any kind of US government pronouncements, announcements, press conferences, videos following a takedown. The first thing, there's definitely a sequence of statements based on position. There's a hierarchy, right? You're going to have the Attorney General, then the FBI Director, then maybe the Deputy Attorney General, and so on, right? Maybe a U.S. Attorney's Office, maybe a Special Agent in charge,
But this is what you're going to see in all these announcements and press conferences. They all take turns getting up and making a statement related to this takedown. Literally every takedown I saw was this kind of language. And of course, these are direct quotes from those narratives. Every bot herder or botnet appeared to be the most sophisticated, the most technologically advanced, the most notorious, the most infamous. And nearly every case featured something that was unprecedented and unique. And they could argue, maybe it was, but you keep seeing a recurring language related to characterizing it this way, which still leads me to question, was that actually the case in these situations? Now I'm paraphrasing, but this is a theme that was consistent through a lot of this research as well, of them essentially communicating these cyber threats are growing more dangerous. Sorry, I'm like behind on that. These cyber threats are growing more dangerous, but we disrupted it, or we are preventing catastrophe. Nearly every takedown I saw in terms of the narratives was always an example of their continued efforts. There always seemed to be references to reminding the people reading this, I think in their case, reminding threat actors, or once again, we've done this or that, and repeated phrasing related to making it crystal clear. So you'd see this language in literally every kind of release, that they seem to be projecting that this is an ongoing thing and we keep having success here. Other initial findings. Most of the references I see are to partner organizations that they've worked with. That's not necessarily surprising. A lot of the audience here, to me, the primary audience seems to be domestic organizations and the American public. And there's nothing wrong with that, but when you have an opportunity to message threat actors directly, they're not taking it. That's what I've seen. Because when you have a botnet takedown, for a period of time, anyone else who worked with those bot herders are paying very close attention to what's said and what's happening. And this is a pivotal moment in their decision making and their motivations for what they're going to do next. And again, I'd see in my own cases I supported, that opportunity was not taken. I mentioned this early on as a hypothesis, and this is what I found so far in this content analysis. Nearly every announcement featured primarily just threatening and consequential language, such as, "We will come for you." I mean, these are actual quotes. "We've been investigating you and your criminal undertakings for a long time, and we will not stop there." There is language often, too, about protecting and safeguarding Americans, which is not something I'm arguing against. They are doing that. But again, the focus on the narrative content for how they're trying to message threat actors is always consequential and threatening. Operation Endgame is a more recent example, and that did involve the DOJ and the NCA, but it was mostly services in the Netherlands that were really pushing that. And this is a good step in the right direction. This kind of language of we could both benefit from an open-hearted dialogue, and they used other forms of content, and they used imagery related to a chessboard. And this was really about setting a stage of like, we just want to have a conversation. There's still some threatening language in there, but it's a step in the right direction. There's also a good example with Lockbit and Lockbit SUP and some of the work the NCA did in the past year with that as well. A different approach. And a lot of that approach is focused on trolling them and ridiculing them and mocking them, which is a great approach. If, again, you want to cause dissension and distrust within like a ransomware gang. But in terms of trying to reach people to influence them to want to cooperate or to come over or to work with you, that wouldn't be the most effective approach. So some of my background discussions with DOJ officials, this is what I'm hearing so far from them. That there is no standard process for designing these communications following a botnet takedown. Of course, there's a separate public affairs process when they're arranging and organizing press conferences and what people are actually going to say. The thing about that is if they make any kind of reference to something in that case, it's got to be based on legal documents, like an affidavit. It has to be pulled from there. But then there's this other language that has nothing to do with that, right? Which is, we've cut you off at the knees, or we're going to find you, or you're going to be next. That's what you typically see, though, with it, and that has nothing to do with the affidavits whatsoever, right? A lot of these announcements are largely personality dependent and based on prior experience. One DOJ attorney that works in this space saying that's what he's typically seen, which is some people have done this stuff before, they have experience with it, they're comfortable with it, and other people haven't. So it just kind of depends on how standard this ends up becoming in terms of like, well, we just go to PR and we're going to have a press conference. But these are missed opportunities to strategically message hundreds, thousands of people that might be involved as affiliates that are watching for a short period of time. And this one was interesting too. There's doubt that they can be influenced to cooperate at all. That was a stunning admission to me, because I think to me that seems to reflect, at this point at least, their approach and attitude towards this. Though they'll tell you too that still, while a lot of the language in these press releases and press conferences seems to be focused on domestic partners and who they worked with, that they are actually trying to deter threat actors. And they're thinking, if we keep taking down threat actors and having these press conferences and using this language, it's going to deter other threat actors. I don't think that's happening, though. Of course, that might just be speculation. But if we keep continuing to see rising cybercrime rates and rising attacks, is it really deterring them? If you look at some of the theories of deterrence and look at it from a cyber context, one thing that's interesting to emphasize with that, at least, is that it doesn't necessarily prevent or stop activity, but deterrence does change the nature of that interaction. But again, there doesn't appear to be any kind of standard protocol or approach to designing this. So what I'm recommending is a model that integrates narrative persuasion and organizational disidentification. I know that seems like a mouthful, that second term, but these are pretty straightforward. So narrative persuasion, this is storytelling. This is a coherent story with characters that might be real, they may not be real. But these are people that you tend to be able to connect with. So when you look at some of the research on narrative persuasion, there are experiences people go through when they're reading a story or watching a story where they might transport, that's the academic term for it, but they start to think about how they've had similar experiences, or they know people who've had similar experiences. And sometimes people reflect on these things at the end. What's so powerful about narrative persuasion, and you see this a lot in marketing, of course, is it's not a logic-based approach. A logic-based approach would be, don't do cybercrime, you're gonna get caught. It's not good for you. But narrative persuasion is different. It's saying, do you know what happened to this person over here? When they did that, this is what happened. And this could be good stories or this could be bad stories. But they consistently find narrative persuasion in marketing is much more influential than trying some kind of logic-based approach. Organizational disidentification, a lot of people are probably less familiar with it, but this comes from Kimberly Ellsbach's work on trust in organizations and organizational perception management, but specifically studies she did on the NRA. And she was trying to look at, does it make a difference where you are along the spectrum of being affiliated with the NRA based on if you have positions or titles within the organization? Do you go to meetings? Do you get things in the mail? I would use this model a lot when I was trying to make some kind of assessment of how loyal or connected someone is to an organization, because that might have some kind of impact on, do we think they're going to be responsive to us or open to us talking? The thing about organizational disidentification, though, is it's less about the organization and more about you. The things you do and the choices you make and what you say and how you represent yourself is saying, I don't represent that organization. That organization is not me. That's organizational disidentification. So what would happen if we just merge this as a model for how we design messaging or strategic messaging to try and talk to and influence threat actors a little bit differently? If you can't see it that well, I'll obviously read through this. And this is like a 30,000 foot view of how you do behavioral analysis. So I wasn't expecting to get into that, but there's two steps, two parts of step one, right? And this can be this simple. If there's a particular person, a threat actor that you want to try and reach or influence, you behaviorally assess that person. This includes anything you can find about them or know about them, but specifically, what are their attitudes towards certain things in their life, and what life experiences have they had, and who are they in relationship with. If you think about the most important decisions you've made in your life, almost always, I guarantee you, you've made that decision somewhat based on how it's going to impact people close to you in your life. So when we would look at ways to influence people, to motivate them to do something we want them to do, it wasn't about some top-down approach or some grand narrative. It was, who are they in relationship with? Who do they love? Who do they hate? Because those are the people that really influence their decision-making. And of course, when you look at someone's attitude towards something, that's really a reflection of their behavioral intention to do something or not do something. Not the past predicts the future, but their attitude towards something. And their life experiences, anytime we are looking at trying to get a perspective on someone, we're always trying to look at, over a period of time, how did they make choices in the aggregate, right? Because the way they made a choice at a different point in their life reflects a lot of variables. But even taking that approach is much more holistic than just saying, we're going to find you, you're next, you're a bad guy too. That's completely backwards, completely backwards. If you think about all the research out there on persuasive communications, it's almost pointless. It hurts what the DOJ is trying to do. That's what I would argue. Now, step 1B is, what if you don't know anything about the people you're trying to reach? You can still approach this much more holistically, right? Instead of thinking about them as just a cyber criminal, what are some common themes among them? I would say one thing with communications with cyber criminals over a number of years was, one theme in particular was, I didn't wake up and think I'm going to grow up to be, I wasn't born one day thinking I'm going to be a cyber criminal. Things happened in my life. Now, regardless if someone's rationalizing, you have a narrative that they're actually going to be responsive to because they want other things in their life. What you would have seen from that video in the beginning is things that you don't see in that video about Olga is everything else that's pulling on her in her life, right? The reasons she came to the U.S. because her daughter and her mother, because of threats she had faced back in Ukraine. All those kind of things, if you think about someone holistically and what they need in their life, that's what they're responsive to, not don't do bad things, don't be a bad guy, or we're going to punish you. That's not effective. Step 2 is applying this model, right? Integrating narrative persuasion, storytelling, and organizational disidentification, appropriate to their culture and their context. And the final thing is communicating that to them, whether it's publicly or it's privately. You can do both. So I want to show you 2 visual applications of it. I definitely don't expect you to read that. I'll just tell you what it is. Scenario A is, what if an affiliate learns that someone they're associated with, who's a bot herder, got arrested? Narrative persuasion, the way you might approach that in terms of your design, is, what if you shared a story with them about someone who's been in a similar position where they were an affiliate and someone that they worked with got arrested, and this is what happened because they did this or they didn't do that. This was the outcome, right? And this could be a cautionary tale, or this could be positive valence. That's like a fancy word for just happy ending, right? It can influence people in different ways. This could include an example of someone who decided to cooperate because they thought, this gives me a chance to bring a family member to a third country to actually get the medical care they need. And how would you apply organizational disidentification there? It could be a number of things, right? It could be focusing on them and the things they need in their life instead of necessarily what they did with that cyber criminal organization. That narrative could also highlight some of the other goals they have outside of crime, because they all do. People in general, as a starting point, are completely malleable. We all have multiple identities and we have multiple roles in a lot of different situations. There's different ways to speak to people based on those roles and those identities that might make them much more responsive. A second scenario, and this is one that did actually happen, was there's a short window before someone's named in an indictment to speak to them privately to try and convince them to leave a country with their family and meet in another country. I can't see it as well unless I look here. And the narrative persuasion in that situation is maybe sharing a story again about another bot herder who was in a similar situation and what happened when they didn't leave, when they had an opportunity, when they stayed in that country with their family. And the idea in that example too is focusing on what will the impact potentially be on their family, not just them, but their family. organizational disidentification in that situation, you could highlight the qualities of that person's family and what they've consistently supported in their family. Their family travels all the time, obviously before anyone knew who they were. What you're trying to support is that families, their children's goals and their dreams, focusing on those kind of things instead of, we're going to get you, you have to pay for what you've done and so forth. So I just want to show you briefly like some of the feedback I've gotten from different cybercrime felons that have worked on this. Someone who was here for 10 years in jail told me if someone had gone to him 10 years ago and said, hey, do you want to come to prison in the US, but at least you'll be here and your family will be waiting for you, he's like, F no. Because of the experience he's gone through, there's mutual distrust, including once they've been imprisoned and they're still working with law enforcement and when they get out. There's distrust from a lot of these agents and there's distrust from these felons. The information exchange doesn't appear to even be transactional. So when they're sharing information about people, hoping it reduces their sentence, a lot of times what they end up hearing is, if that information didn't result in someone actually being arrested, we can't really help you reduce your sentence with it. So a lot of these people feel abandoned and that distrust surges. There's really no material offer in return. What's the actual proposal? I'd have to say, beyond even the narratives, there is really no proposal, material proposal from the US government. One question from a cybercrime felon was, well, who are we actually talking about in cybercrime? This is one of his quotes. Majority of them are swindlers, scammers, extortionists, those type of people. I don't even know what they want. I don't agree with that, though. I think all those people also have dreams, goals, and motivations that they're going to be responsive to. Final thing here is policy gaps in future research. Foreign cybercriminal felons, they're not eligible to apply for political asylum. So immigration status is the biggest challenge they face, because when they get out of jail or when their probationary period ends, they typically have no immigration status and they can't even apply for asylum. So even if they're afraid to go back to their country because they're facing threats, they're really stuck. Getting hired is the second biggest challenge, right? Most Americans, I don't think they actually know what a lot of these felons go through in prison and when they get out. Those stories haven't really been coming out, and I'm working on trying to share those stories because I think people might have a different perspective on them as other people when they hear about the other things going on in their life, right? Not to rationalize what they did, but where they are now after they've done this time. Some states and counties in the US are actually removing a question on applications about being a felon. It could at least get them to a first interview, but that's promising. I think there's a space here to start influencing and changing attitudes towards this. I have other research I'm developing now that's trying to explore those attitudes of NGOs and nonprofits toward consulting cybercrime felons to help them protect their network, even if it's a one-time thing. Definitely provocative, but it might actually be an interesting option if you imagine what they could do, because they're talented. I know they're dangerously talented, but they're talented to help shore up some of the defense of these very vulnerable networks. And the final thing is encouraging cyber criminals who are involved in also supporting cyber espionage to become whistleblowers. I'm looking into research on that as well, because there are definitely some changing cultural norms in China and in Russia about disclosing and leaking and becoming whistleblowers. And this just comes down to looking at someone holistically. They're not just a cyber criminal, they're someone who has extreme talent, unique access, and they could be very disruptive out there if they find evidence of wrongdoing and fraud that they want to share that could benefit the public. That's all I have. Thank you for your time.